December 1944. Three German musicians captured at the Battle of Bulge stood in an American POW camp, certain they'd face a firing squad. Nazi propaganda had promised them nothing less than execution at the hands of Jewish gangsters and American savages. Instead, the camp commander opened a storage room and handed them violins, cellos, and sheet music. But how does being treated humanely by your enemy destroy everything you believed in more powerfully than any bullet ever could? December 1944. The snow fell thick and white across the Belgian forest, where Hans Meyer lay face down in the frozen mud. His violin fingers, the same fingers that once played Beethoven in the great concert halls of Berlin, now clutched a broken radio set. Just 3 years ago, he wore a black suit and bow tie on stage. Now he wore the gray uniform of the Wehrmacht, and American soldiers stood over him with rifles pointed at his head. Hans was 28 years old. Before the war, he played violin for the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. He performed for crowds who clapped and threw flowers. He made enough money to buy his mother a new coat every winter. Then, in 1942, a letter came. The letter said he must join the army. Germany needed every man to fight. It did not matter if you played music or fixed shoes or taught children. Everyone had to become a soldier. Next to Hans in the mud lay Kurt Schmidt. Kurt was 35 and had sung opera in Munich. His voice could fill a theater without any microphone. Women cried when he sang sad songs. Men stood up and cheered when he hit the high notes. But none of that mattered now. The army gave him a rifle and taught him how to kill. They put him in the infantry and sent him to fight Americans. A few feet away, young Friedrich Weber tried not to shake. Friedrich was only 22 years old. He came from Hamburg and played piano in secret clubs. He loved American jazz music, the kind with trumpets and drums that made people want to dance. But jazz was forbidden in Germany. The Nazi government said jazz was evil music, made by inferior people. Friedrich played it anyway, late at night when nobody could hear. Now he wondered if he would die for loving the music of the enemy. The three men had never met before the war. They came from different cities and played different kinds of music, but the army threw them together in the same unit. When they discovered they were all musicians, they talked about concerts and composers during the long, cold nights. It helped them forget about the war for a few minutes. It helped them remember who they used to be. Hans remembered what his commanding officer told them before the battle. The officer said Americans were gangsters and criminals. He said they were controlled by Jews who wanted to destroy Germany. He said, if you get captured, they will torture you. They will pull out your fingernails. They will starve you. They will shoot you in the back of the head. The officer looked each soldier in the eyes and said it is better to die fighting than to surrender. Hans believed him. Everyone believed him. They had heard the same message on the radio, in newspapers, in speeches. America was the enemy. Americans were monsters. Kurt remembered the propaganda posters he saw all over Munich. The posters showed Americans as evil creatures with big teeth and cruel eyes. They showed piles of dead German prisoners. The words on the posters said, "Americans show no mercy." Kurt's own brother told him to save the last bullet for himself if he got surrounded. Better a quick death than what the Americans would do to him. Friedrich thought about his family back in Hamburg. He had not received a letter in 4 months. He did not know if they were still alive. British and American planes bombed Hamburg night after night. The whole city was burning. His mother wrote in her last letter that they only had enough food for one small meal each day. She said they made soup from potato peels. She said his little sister was so thin her bones showed through her skin. The government kept saying Germany was winning the war. But if Germany was winning, why was everyone starving? Why were the cities burning? Why were they here in Belgium, cold and hungry and losing? The American soldiers pulled the three musicians to their feet. Hans waited for the bullet. Kurt closed his eyes. Friedrich whispered a prayer. But the bullet never came. Instead, the Americans searched them for weapons and marched them through the snow to a truck. Other captured German soldiers already sat in the truck. They all had the same look on their faces: fear, confusion, waiting to die. The truck drove for hours. Nobody spoke. The Americans gave them nothing. Hans thought this was it. They were driving them somewhere quiet to shoot them all at once. It would be easier that way. Dig one big hole and dump all the bodies inside. He wondered if anyone would tell his mother what happened to him. He wondered if she would ever know where his body was buried. But then something strange happened. The truck stopped at a camp with tall fences. American soldiers opened the gates. Other soldiers led them into a building that was warm inside. Warm. Hans could not remember the last time he felt warm. The building had lights that actually worked. It smelled like soap and cooked food. His stomach hurt from hunger. He had eaten nothing but hard bread for 3 days. An American soldier handed him a bowl. Hot soup. Actual meat floating in the broth. Hans stared at it. Was this poisoned? Was this a trick? Kurt took his bowl with shaking hands. Friedrich just stood there, looking confused. The American soldier pointed at the benches and made eating motions. Sit down. Eat. The three musicians sat. They ate slowly at first, then faster. The soup was hot and salty and real. It was more food than German civilians got in a whole day. They were prisoners of war, and they were eating better than their families back home. After the soup, something even stranger happened. An officer came in with papers and a pen. He spoke a little bit of German. He asked each prisoner their name, their age, and where they came from. Then he asked a question that made no sense at all. He asked what job you did before the war. Hans said he played violin. Kurt said he sang opera. Friedrich said he played piano. The officer wrote it all down like it mattered. Like maybe they were still people, and not just enemy soldiers. Like maybe they were musicians, and not just prisoners waiting to die. 2 weeks later, Hans stood in the middle of Camp Concordia in Kansas and could not believe what he was seeing. The train ride from the East Coast took 5 days. He watched America pass by through the small window. Endless farmland, huge factories with smoke rising from chimneys, towns with houses that looked perfect and clean. Cars are everywhere. So many cars. In Germany, only rich people had cars. Here, it seemed like everyone did. The camp sat in flat land that went on forever. The barracks were wooden buildings painted white. Inside, each man got his own bed with a real mattress. Not straw on the floor. Not a thin blanket on hard wood. An actual mattress with springs that squeaked when you sat down. The building had a stove in the middle that kept it warm. Hans touched the walls. They were solid. No holes, no wind coming through cracks. At night, electric lights turned on with a switch. Back home, his family used candles because there was no electricity half the time. The first real meal in the camp made Hans want to cry. Breakfast was eggs, bread with butter, coffee with real sugar, and oatmeal with milk. He stared at his plate. This was more food than his mother had for 3 days. The bread was soft and white, not the hard black bread mixed with sawdust that they ate in Germany. The butter was yellow and creamy. He had not seen real butter in 2 years. He spread it thick on his bread and ate slowly, trying to make it last. Kurt sat next to him and whispered, "This is more than my family ate in Munich before I left. Much more. I got a letter from my wife last year. She said they wait in line for 4 hours to buy one loaf of bread. Sometimes the bread runs out before they get to the front of the line. Here, they throw away the old bread to make room for fresh bread." Friedrich could not stop looking at everything. The kitchen where they cooked the food was as big as a factory. Huge pots that could feed 100 men at once. Machines that peeled potatoes faster than 10 people with knives. An American soldier told him the kitchen made 3,000 meals every single day. 3,000. The industrial power of it amazed him. Everything in America seemed to run on machines and electricity and endless supplies. Every week, trucks came with Red Cross boxes. Each prisoner got his own box. Inside were things Friedrich thought he would never see again. Chocolate bars wrapped in shiny paper, cigarettes in neat packs of 20, canned meat, powdered milk, hard candy, soap that smelled like flowers. The prisoners traded these things like money. 2 chocolate bars for 1 pack of cigarettes. 3 cans of meat for a bar of soap. But there was so much that nobody went without. Even the poorest prisoner had chocolate. One morning, a green truck drove through the camp gates. On the side, it said Coca-Cola in fancy red letters. Friedrich had heard about Coca-Cola. It was an American drink that came in glass bottles. The Nazis said it was poison that rotted your teeth and made you weak, but American soldiers drank it all the time. They seemed pretty strong to Friedrich. The truck stopped at the canteen, and men unloaded wooden crates full of bottles. Each prisoner could buy 1 bottle for 5 cents using their camp money. Friedrich bought one and took a tiny sip. It was cold and sweet, and burned his throat in a good way. It tasted like America, bold and different, and a little bit wild. The strangest thing happened 2 months after they arrived. Hans was walking past the recreation building when he heard music. German music, classical music, a Beethoven symphony playing on a radio. He stopped and listened. An American guard stood nearby, also listening. The guard saw Hans and smiled. "Good music," the guard said in broken German. "You like Beethoven?" Hans nodded. The guard asked him if he knew other German composers. They talked for 20 minutes about Mozart, Bach, and Wagner. The guard said his grandmother came from Germany and taught him to love music. Hans realized something that confused him. This American guard respected German culture. He did not hate everything about Germany. He just hated the Nazis. The camp even had a library, a whole building full of books. German books. Novels and poetry and science books. Newspapers, too, though someone cut out certain articles. Hans found books he read as a boy, stories that made him remember home when home was good. Kurt found opera music written on paper so he could practice singing again. Friedrich discovered they had American books translated into German. He read about cowboys and detectives and adventures. Books the Nazis had burned in Germany were just sitting on shelves here for anyone to read. Then, one day in early spring, the camp commander called all the prisoners to the main yard. He stood on a platform and spoke through a translator. He said the camp was starting a recreation program. Men could play sports, take classes, or do hobbies. He asked if anyone played musical instruments. Hans, Kurt, and Friedrich raised their hands. So did 15 other men. The commander smiled and told them to follow him. They walked to a storage building Hans had never been inside. The commander unlocked the door. Inside were instruments. Violins in cases, cellos, trumpets, clarinets, a drum set, piles of sheet music. The instruments were not new. but they were clean and tuned and ready to play. Hans picked up a violin and held it like he was holding a baby. His hands remembered the shape. His fingers found the strings. Kurt said what they were all thinking. "We thought they would give us shovels to dig our own graves. They gave us instruments to make music." Friedrich touched a piano in the corner. The keys were ivory and smooth. He pressed one note. It rang out, clear and true. The commander said through the translator that they could form an orchestra. They could practice twice a week. They could give concerts for the other prisoners, maybe even for the guards. Hans looked at Kurt. Kurt looked at Friedrich. None of them understood. How could the enemy give them back the thing that made them human? How could captivity feel more free than serving their own country? That night, Hans lay in his warm bed in the clean barracks and thought about his family in Berlin. They were cold and hungry and living in bombed buildings. He was warm and fed and playing violin again. Something was very wrong with this picture. But the wrongness was not what the Nazis told him to expect. The wrongness was that everything they said about America was a lie. Christmas Eve 1944 arrived cold and clear. Hans had been practicing violin for 6 weeks now. His fingers hurt at first because they were not used to playing anymore. But slowly, the music came back to him. The orchestra had 23 men. They played every Tuesday and Thursday evening in the recreation hall. Some men played perfectly. Others made mistakes and had to start over. But they all played together, and that was what mattered. The camp commander asked if they would give a concert for Christmas. A real concert with an audience. Hans said yes before he could think about it. They spent 3 weeks preparing. They would play Handel's Messiah, a piece about hope and redemption and new beginnings. The irony was not lost on Hans. Here they were, German prisoners of war, playing Christian music about salvation in an American camp while their country burned. The night of the concert, Hans looked out from behind the curtain. The recreation hall was packed. Hundreds of German prisoners sat in rows of wooden chairs. But in the back stood something that made Hans freeze. American families from the nearby town. Women in nice dresses. Men in suits. Children holding their parents' hands. They came to watch German prisoners perform music. Hans felt Kurt grab his arm. "Do you see them?" Kurt whispered. "Why would they come? We are the enemy. We tried to kill their sons and brothers." Friedrich said nothing, but his hands shook as he held his sheet music. The music started. Hans drew his bow across the violin strings, and the sound filled the hall like water filling a cup. Clean and pure and perfect. Kurt's voice rose above the instruments, strong and clear. Friedrich's fingers danced across the piano keys. For 2 hours, they were not prisoners. They were not soldiers. They were not German or American. They were just musicians making something beautiful in a broken world. When the final note ended, silence hung in the air for 3 long seconds. Then everyone stood up. The prisoners clapped. The American guards clapped. The families from town clapped. An old woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. A little girl smiled and waved at Hans. He did not know what to do, so he bowed. They all bowed. The audience clapped louder. After the concert, the camp served a Christmas feast. Hans walked into the dining hall and stopped breathing. The tables were covered with white cloth. Plates and forks and knives were set out like in a fancy restaurant. And the food. Hans had never seen so much food in his whole life. Roasted turkeys the size of small dogs, bowls of mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, cranberry sauce that gleamed like red jewels, fresh bread rolls piled in baskets, corn and green beans and carrots, and desserts, apple pies and pumpkin pies and cookies and cakes. In the corner sat a machine making ice cream, actual ice cream, in winter, in a prison camp. Hans filled his plate until food spilled over the edges. He sat down and ate until his stomach hurt. Around him, other prisoners did the same. Some men cried while they ate. This meal had more food than their entire families would see in a month. Back in Germany, people were dying of hunger. Children looked like skeletons. Old people ate grass to fill their bellies. And here, prisoners of war ate turkey and pie and ice cream. Kurt sat across from Hans with his head in his hands. He was not eating. He was just staring at his plate. Hans asked him what was wrong. Kurt looked up, and his eyes were wet with tears. "We are the enemy," Kurt said. "We invaded countries. We bombed cities. We killed their soldiers. Why do they treat us like this? Why do they give us music and food and warmth? What kind of people feed the men who tried to destroy them?" Hans had no answer. He had been asking himself the same question for months. That night, alone in his bunk, he pulled out a small notebook he kept hidden. The guards let them have paper and pencils. Hans wrote in tiny letters so he could fit more words on each page. He wrote about what he saw and what he felt, and what it meant. "We were told America was weak," he wrote. "We were told it was run by criminals and Jews and people who only cared about money. We were told Americans were cowards who would run away from a real fight. We were told they lived in poverty and chaos, but they have so much they give it to their prisoners. They have so much they waste food we would kill for back home. We have nothing. Our cities are rubble. Our people starve. Our children freeze. Yet our Führer promised us the whole world. He said we were the master race. He said we would rule for 1,000 years. But if we are so superior, why are we the ones starving? If they are so weak, why are we the ones in prison camps eating their leftover food?" Spring came and prisoners were sent to work on nearby farms. The farmers needed help planting crops because their sons were away fighting the war, fighting against Germany. Yet here were German prisoners coming to help plant their fields. Hans, Kurt, and Friedrich were sent to work on a farm owned by a man named Mr. Peterson. He was 60 years old with white hair and rough hands. His son was in Europe fighting Germans. Mr. Peterson knew this, but he treated the three musicians with respect. At lunch, Mr. Burby Fee, Peterson's wife, brought food to the field. Sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, fresh milk, cookies still warm from the oven. She smiled at them and said, "Eat up, boys." She called them boys, not prisoners, not enemies, just boys. She showed them pictures of her son in his uniform. She said she prayed every night that someone somewhere was being kind to him if he got captured. She looked at Hans and said, "I hope someone is feeding your mother too." Hans almost broke down right there. This woman's son was fighting against Germany. Maybe her son shot Hans in Belgium. Maybe Hans shot at her son. But here she was, feeding him and showing him kindness. The logic of it made no sense, except it made perfect sense in a way that everything Hans learned in Germany never did. Friedrich finally got permission to play American jazz music. A guard had a trumpet and asked Friedrich to play with him. They played Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, music the Nazis called degenerate, music they said would poison German culture. But the music was joyful and alive and free. It made people smile. It made people tap their feet. There was nothing evil about it. It was just music. And music belonged to everyone. Hans realized something that changed everything in his mind. "They did not break us with cruelty," he told Kurt one evening. "They broke us with kindness. The Nazis taught us that strength meant crushing your enemies. But Americans showed us that real strength means being kind, even to people who tried to kill you. We spent years learning to hate. They spent a few months teaching us we were wrong." May 1946. The war was over, and Hans was going home. He stood on the deck of the ship, taking him back to Germany. The ocean was gray and cold. Other prisoners stood with him, all silent, all thinking about what they would find. Hans carried a small bag with everything he owned. Inside were 3 chocolate bars he saved, a pack of coffee beans wrapped in paper, 2 cans of meat, a small bag of sugar, and something more valuable than any of it: a jazz record Friedrich gave him, and a new way of seeing the world. The ship docked in a German port that Hans did not recognize. The buildings were broken. Half of them were just piles of bricks and twisted metal. The streets were full of holes from bombs. People walked around like ghosts, thin and gray and tired. Everyone looked hungry. Everyone looked defeated. Hans had not seen Germany in 2 years. He knew it would be bad. But knowing and seeing are 2 different things. The train to Berlin took 3 days. It should have taken 8 hours, but the tracks were broken in so many places that the train had to stop and go around. Sometimes everyone got off and walked for miles, because there was no track at all. Hans looked out the window at his country. Everywhere he looked, he saw destruction. Entire cities were just rubble. Factories were burned out shells. Bridges were blown apart. Fields had craters from bombs instead of crops. This was the 1,000-year empire they were promised. It lasted 12 years and left Germany in ruins. Berlin was worse than anything Hans imagined. He walked through streets he grew up on and could not tell where he was. Every building looked the same because every building was destroyed. Mountains of broken concrete blocked roads. The smell of death still hung in the air even though the fighting stopped a year ago. People dug through the rubble looking for anything useful: a nail, a piece of wood, a brick that was not broken. Children with dirty faces asked him for food. Old women pulled carts full of firewood because there was no coal, and winter was always coming. Hans found his old neighborhood. The apartment building where he lived with his mother was half standing. The front was gone, like someone cut the building in half with a giant knife. He could see into apartments, a chair hanging from a broken floor, wallpaper flapping in the wind, a bathtub suspended in air 3 stories up. He climbed the stairs carefully because some steps were missing. He climbed to the 4th floor. His mother's apartment. She was there, alive. Hans almost did not recognize her. She weighed maybe 90 pounds. Her hair was white, even though she was only 55. Her dress hung on her like a tent because she was so thin. But her eyes recognized him immediately. She grabbed him and held him and cried into his shoulder. "You are fat," she said. "You are healthy. Where have you been that you look so good?" Hans unpacked his bag on the kitchen table. The chocolate bars, the coffee, the canned meat, the sugar. His mother stared at these things like they were gold and diamonds. She picked up a chocolate bar with shaking hands. "Hans," she whispered, "I have not seen chocolate in 3 years." "Where did you get this?" he told her. "From the Americans, from the prison camp." She looked at him confused. "The prison camp gave you chocolate?" Hans told her everything: the food, the warm barracks, the instruments, the Christmas concert, the American families who came to watch. The farmer's wife showed him pictures and gave him cookies. His mother listened and cried. "You ate better as a prisoner than we ate as free Germans," she said. "You were safe in America while we were bombed every night. You had electricity and heat and music while we froze and starved in the dark." The truth of it hit Hans like a punch to the stomach. He spent 2 years in an enemy prison camp, and those were the best 2 years of the war. He was warmer, safer, and better fed as an American prisoner than as a German citizen. What did that say about Germany? What did that say about the promises they were given? What did that say about the leaders who sent millions of men to die for a lie? Hans tried to return to his old life. The Berlin Philharmonic was gone. The concert hall was a pile of rubble. Most of the musicians were dead or missing. There was no money to pay musicians anyway. Nobody had money for concerts when they did not have money for bread. But the Americans who now occupied Berlin started programs to rebuild German culture. They wanted to show Germans what democracy looked like, what freedom looked like. They hired Hans to teach music to children. They paid him in American dollars, which could buy food on the black market. Kurt had a different path. He could not stay in Germany. Everything reminded him of what was lost. His wife died in the bombing of Munich. His opera house was destroyed. His voice was still strong, but his heart was broken. In 1952, he got permission to move to America. He settled in Wisconsin, where there were many German immigrants. He taught music at a university. He sang in a church choir. He married an American woman whose family came from Germany 2 generations ago. He lived there until he died in 1978, and he never regretted leaving. Friedrich stayed in Hamburg and opened a music school. He taught piano and jazz to anyone who wanted to learn. The same jazz music the Nazis said was evil. He taught his students that music has no nationality, that culture belongs to everyone. The moment you start saying some people's art is wrong because of who they are, you stop being human. His school is still open today, run by his daughter. But Hans never forgot. In 1985, a young reporter came to interview him. She was writing about German prisoners in America. She asked him what he learned from being captured. Hans was 69 years old then. His hands were too stiff to play violin anymore. But his mind was sharp, and his memory was clear. He said this: "I was captured twice in the war. First by American soldiers at the Bulge. Second by the Truth in that Kansas camp. The first capture ended when I went home. The second never did. They gave us instruments when we expected execution. Fed us when we expected starvation. Treated us as humans when we expected to be treated as Nazis. That was not weakness. That was strength we never understood. The Reich promised us dignity through conquest. America gave us dignity through captivity. That is what I learned. And what Germany needed to learn. About what real civilization means. Hans died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall came down. He lived long enough to see Germany rebuild. Long enough to see democracy take root. Long enough to know that the lesson he learned in that Kansas prison camp was the lesson his whole country needed to learn. That true strength is not about crushing your enemies. True strength is about staying human, even when everything tells you to stop. The Americans did not defeat Germany with bombs alone. They defeated Germany by showing German prisoners what their own country could never show them: kindness, abundance, dignity, freedom, and the simple revolutionary idea that even your enemy deserves to be treated like a human being.